This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Facing Apocalypse. It's a book written by Catherine Keller, and we will spend the next hour or more talking about it. Catherine Keller is my guest, and she has written a book called Facing Apocalypse, Climate, Democracy, and Other Last Chances. We're going to be talking about that, but as I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves. So welcome, Catherine. If you could give a 2 or 3 minute précis of your life for anyone watching this.
Well, the 2 or 3 minute version will avoid the chaos of it, and I know chaos is a theme of your interviews and of your thinking, but I won't go deep into that dimension. So I'm a theologian. I'm what's called a constructive theologian. That's not the opposite of destructive. It's often deconstructive theology that I find myself involved in. Theology means some kind of reflection on ultimacies that does tap into the theos metaphor, the discourse of the divine that has played such an ambiguous role in our history. So that's what I've been doing for what will pretty soon be half a century. And I could say more about the various books I've written or about the background that got me into it, but I'm not sure how much of that you'd want right now. I did not come from any kind of stable background, let alone a background that involved a particular religious tradition or denomination. It was much more chaotic and improvisatory, eclectic. My parents were at least survivors. So theology was something that I largely, though with tips from them, surely found my way to pretty early and just lucked out because already at age 17, I became aware, which would be around 1970, early 70s, I found that there was a connection forming between the women's movement and theology itself and theological practices. That utterly intrigued me. And I had a course on the so-called Old Testament that hooked me in as a freshman to the discourse. And so I was off and running because this feminist challenge to God the Father and Son to this hyper-patriarchy, but a challenge that could also draw on deep Christian resources in order to lodge its point with internal energy, really carried me into beautiful and life-transforming conversations and communities. I don't know what you want to hear more than that. I've been teaching at Drew Theological School, part of Drew University in New Jersey, for 30 plus years. And so part of my work is the training of folk for Christian ministries of various kinds. But I also have students of other religions, Jewish, Buddhist, and I, in addition, teach in an academic MA and PhD program. A lot of my energy goes into mentoring doctoral students who go on to teach in religion and philosophy, and who are great interlocutors for me. So I could say more about the kind of theology it is that I do and how we bounce into a conversation on apocalypse. But
well, what denomination were you raised in, and are you still that denomination? And do you consider yourself approaching theology from a philosophic standpoint or from a literalist standpoint?
I have, from the moment that I became aware of what theology is around age 17, been a rather fervent anti-literalist. That was the only theology that was possible to me, a richly literary and philosophical approach to theology that was always intensively interdisciplinary. And when done right, theology is probably the most interdisciplinary of disciplines from its very beginning, with its synthesis with philosophy, with its work with with ritual and the arts, with all of its commitment to community, etc. I didn't grow up in a particular denomination. I was baptized at some point as a Presbyterian, but we didn't do church regularly, except when my stepfather, who was a survivor of the Second World War from Germany, would play pastor for a while. That was one way he could earn a living for a while and pretend to have those credentials. So it was a very strange background in that way. But I found my way into a Christianity that was multi-denominational. It's been largely Protestant. The seminary I teach in is affiliated with the United Methodist denomination, and I'm a United Methodist at this point because I found that affiliation very satisfying. But this is the branch of United Methodism that supports LGBTQ ordination, that's profoundly ecumenical and committed to dialogues with every other discipline. But that's a hint of it. But I have been glad to be involved in the progressive wing of the United Methodist denomination for these last 3 decades. That's been a good place to work.
Well, sometimes in the course of a day or before an interview, little synchronicities happen. And I was arguing with some people on another website. There was a forum, and I'll relate this to your book in a moment. There was a forum about recidivism and the role of forgiveness in the American justice system. And certain people were talking about, well, they could forgive anyone but a rapist or whatnot. They could forgive a terrorist. They could forgive a mass murderer or whatnot. And I was arguing back and forth. Well, what do you mean by a rapist? But a lot of them would say they're only men. Women can't rape or the sexual assault. And it got me thinking about your book, Apocalypse, in that I wonder what the role of forgiveness, either religious-wise or from a more secular point of view, is going to be in 100 or more years if we leave a barren wasteland or ruin the planet. So let me just ask you in a broad sense about, does the role of forgiveness within a non-secular society or even a secular one, how does that figure into this idea of apocalypse and global warming that figures so much in your book?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, what one has to grasp quickly is that biblically speaking and post-biblically, forgiveness should not be understood as letting someone off a hook. Yeah. Forgiveness doesn't mean absolution from responsibility. Whatever it is you have done to me, to say I forgive you does not mean that what you did was okay. It doesn't mean that you should not be held responsible, possibly to the end of your life. It does mean that I trust that something in you is still truly human and capable of transformation. And when I see clues and hints of that growth, of that transformation, then my forgiveness can become more open to an actually active sense of respect. But the radicality of forgiveness in the Christian tradition is not about saying any ill doings are okay or should just be forgotten about. So to say I forgive you to a rapist isn't something that I would know how to do, except after, if it were an experience I had except after there had been some process in which it was clear that the rapist was repentant and was undergoing some kind of step, some kind of process of self-transformation. Then I might even be able to articulate some form of forgiveness. But this comes down to the really difficult and often alienating notion of the love of the enemy in Christianity, and that can't be treated sentimentally. It doesn't mean we don't have enemies. It doesn't mean we should just yield our lives to enemies or to destruction. That would be truly wasteful. But it does mean that there's a chance. There's a chance of a rectification of relations that have gone deeply askew. And my practice of forgiveness would be to give that chance a chance, to be open to that possibility, not to be naive.
Yeah. For those who might be watching this 5, 10 years hence or more, recently the Supreme Court, well, they didn't rule on it yet, but recently Texas enacted a law, an anti-abortion law, where not only could people who assist, even someone driving someone to an abortion clinic, could be charged with a crime, but you'd have people who are acting as sort of snoops that would get a $10,000 bounty for turning in a woman for getting an abortion or that kind of thing. And I'm just wondering, before we dig into the book, and certainly I think for the species and the planet, global warming is the biggest existential threat. But little things, smaller things like this, I'm just, I would assume that you're what they call pro-choice, and I'm just wondering, what do you make as a Christian philosopher about the current tenor of the United States politically and ethically in many of the ways? I mean, personally, I'm someone who votes mainly third parties. I don't buy the Democrats or the Republicans. But what is your just general tenor, and then we'll dig into the book.
Well, my general sense of the tenor of the United States is that it is at least deeply ambiguous right now. That there are forces, there are publics, there are tendencies towards a more sustainable planetarity and towards a more humane human society, right? There are tendencies in the right direction that have not been squelched, that may in fact be strengthening themselves gradually, perhaps too slowly. And at the same time, there are reactions that are scary, and the Texas anti-choice law is a good example. And of course, I know endless Texans who are feminists, who are appalled, and who are fighting this. But right, I mean, we're in a dangerously polarized condition in the United States, and yet it's not as though there are simply two pure sides, and your position, which is not Democrat or Republican, is an illustration of how the polarization doesn't just account for itself in terms of two poles, Democrat, Republican, or left, right. There are, however, massive contradictory forces that the so-called moderate forces aren't really able very effectively to mediate, and that the radical forces on either side are not able to control. The radical forces on my side don't imagine that we would be able to gain control, but we hope for a greater, wider radicalization, which would be a mobilization of progressive forces in time, from my point of view and that of many, and I think perhaps of yours all. First of all, to save the possibility of a habitable planet, a planet that would give us a chance to fight out some of our other differences. Right now, a lot of our political differences are going to seem pretty petty by the middle of the century if we don't get hold of climate change. I do think there are tendencies in that direction. I think there's been some serious international response, even to the latest United Nations study, but it's disappointing response. I have a friend in Sweden who was fighting for that, especially in Norway. I have a friend who was hoping the Greens could really come through in this last election to bring down Norway's dependence on its oil industry, and the Greens made headway, but again, not nearly what was hoped for. So even where relatively relatively smart and civilized publics are struggling around climate change, the progress is too slow, and that's certainly the case here. However, there is growth. I have a bit of hopefulness that the extremities of this summer's environmental catastrophes that are just going on. I mean, you just watch ABC News, and every night there's like some new storm or hurricane going on, and there's another flash to the fires that are just going on and on in the West. And this is standard news. And ABC News is actually using the phrase climate change now. That's a good sign. Because mainline news channels were never using that phrase. Except to talk about someone talking about it occasionally. And now they're just saying that's what this is expressing. So I do think that we're getting a higher level of widespread catastrophes. The storms keep rolling through very Republican territories of the South. I mean, it's still terrible for what Louisiana is suffering again and again. So the evidence of climate change is getting harder and harder to explain away or to repress. And I have a bit of hope that could start leading to some significant shifts. But I will say theologically, just one little thing, that I strongly distinguish hope from optimism. A very famous theologian, Karl Barth, whom I mostly disagree with because he was pretty conservative in his Reformed Protestantism, but this I agree with. He said, as Christians, we are not optimistic or pessimistic. We are hopeful. So that sense of a rigorous hope that's not optimistic, that's not depending on anything working out, and that sees that the trends are not promising, nonetheless leaves space in which one can discern promising potentialities that might not win, but that have a chance. And so it's really worth putting our energies into them.
So, Catherine, now let's talk about the book. I want to talk first about two definitions or two words you use and talk about them as applies to the book. The first is the word apocalypse, and you make sure to know that it means open eyes, not what necessarily people think it does. And I think that's an interesting ploy to open the book, because the book basically deals with an anti-scientific bent in a lot of society. And whether we're talking abortion, whether we're talking global warming or climate change, and a number of other things, especially here in the age of COVID and masking or not masking, there seems to be, especially here in the United States, an utterly bizarre rejection of science and even welfare for oneself. People would rather shoot, all kinds of toxins into their body rather than take rigorously tested vaccines. So tell me about the term apocalypse as we think of it and how you define it in the book.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. I'm partly using apocalypse because it has an almost unequaled dramatic oomph to it, doesn't it? It puts out the signal of danger, warning, threat, and it puts it out not only with the sense of alarm, but with some sense of ancient reverberation. Where the biblical metaphor still always trickles through, even in utterly secular uses of the term. And I'm interested in both secular and religious uses of the term. And those uses vary widely in both of those fields, in fields of secular usage and religious understandings. So the way I'm using the term is actually in the biblical sense. It's the original word apokalypsis in the Greek, does mean not the end, not doom. It means unveiling. In fact, the original usage of it was for the unveiling of a bride on her wedding night. So actually, apocalypse is a kind of erotic term in that way. And interestingly, the book of Revelation does end with the erotic imagery of the marriage of the New Jerusalem, the Virgin, with the Lamb. That's the trope for the kind of utopian outcome. It's a marriage, and the actual wedding celebration. So I think that's not altogether accidental. That's the original usage of the term apocalypsis. So it means unveiling, revealing, disclosure, not closure. That's the point I'm always wanting to make. But of course, in the context in which we receive it, coming out of Jewish apocalypticism and then the book of Revelation, which became the basis for the Christian analog of Jewish apocalypticism, in that tradition, these are very, very stern disclosures. These are catastrophic revelations. They are revelations of great crisis, great trauma, great destruction, both of the human and the non-human populations and structures of the planet. However, they don't depict the end of the world. That just doesn't happen. There's great violence, no more than there's already been in the 2,000 years since the letter was written, and the book of Revelation was originally a letter. But yeah, there's great violence, there's great confrontation, there's slaughter, there's the coming down of the empire that is coded as the beast and the dragon. It's code for the Roman Empire, which was the great oppressor of the time in which John of Patmos wrote the book of Revelation. So it's about the confrontation with the empire that controlled the known world, known at least from the point of view of John of Patmos, within the Greco-Roman Empire, and of the Jewish people and the Jewish followers of Jesus. The Roman Empire was the big fiend. So it encodes, so that Romans couldn't too easily decode it, it encodes the destruction of the Roman global empire and of its global economy. The economy is coded as the whore of Babylon. So the promiscuity of the great whore with, endless luxury products. So it's itself a parable about the coming down of the empire in its time and its global economy, and of horrendous mass destruction in the process, including great destruction of much of the planet, the non-human planet. And it's very symbolic, very dreamlike or nightmarish, but there's no final end of the world. That's just not what it's about. There is a collapse of the known order, almost in inconceivable levels of violence, and there's the almost inconceivable renewal. There's the new creation. There's the disclosure of this new Jerusalem, a new urban non-imperial civilization in which the representatives, the kings of all the nations, come in through the gates, which are open 24/7. So there are hints of a new civilization, but it's all in very mythic imagery. But I thought it was important to just get out into the discourse of apocalypse, that in the original context, it does refer to terrible catastrophes. It does not refer to the end of the world. Mm. And it's worth meditating on that together, because why? Because we're going to hear the uses of the term apocalypse, all over and over again. About a year ago exactly, the LA Times started to quite routinely refer to the California fire apocalypse.
Yeah.
We just endlessly hear the word apocalypse, understandably used. So we need to get word out that that's okay. That's actually an appropriate use, but only if we realize what the word actually means.
And then we go even further with things like the doomsday clock idea. But I want to go from this ancient definition to a more modern one as my second word. And when I was a little boy, I used to read a lot of science books, a lot of little golden books back from the 50s and 60s where you could read about dinosaurs. And I knew all about that, what was then called the Precambrian, and then the Paleozoic, the Cenozoic, the Mesozoic eras. And right now we're in the Cenozoic era, and you talk about the 6 extinctions a bit later in the book. And I know how the Permian Triassic, there was the great event that 95% of life was wiped out, and that gave rise to the dinosaurs. Then at the Cretaceous, now called Paleogene event, which separated the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, that wiped out all the dinosaurs. Some people consider birds dinosaurs, though, the non-avian dinosaurs. And you use a term that has been bandied about the last few years called the Anthropocene. Uh, and those are terms like the Paleogene, the Paleocene, the Oligocene, I believe. And these are sort of the little epochs within the eras. But I'm wondering if the impact of mankind, not only with the release of carbons, but with plastic and the garbage that's going around, if we are actually moving away, not just with an epoch within an epoch within the Cenozoic, the Anthropocene, but maybe we're moving into the Homozoic, the man-made era, that we're leaving the Cenozoic perhaps. So what is your take just in the use of the word Anthropocene? Because to me, a term like Homozoic might even be more, indicate even a bigger shift, a fundamental shift. Or is that just hubris on humanity's part to say that?
Well, of course, that would be the danger of the term, wouldn't it? That it would be snapped up and be very useful for precisely that dangerous and self-destructive self-confidence of our particular species. But the Anthropocene can work both ways too, as a term, right? It can suggest that the anthropos has come into full magisterial dominance, so we'll take care of our own problems. Thank you very much. Or it can be a way of recognizing, as I think the term is originally intended, that this is an unbearably suspenseful moment because we are now the single greatest causal influence on the planet, and that's not good news, because most of our planet-wide influence right now is proving to be tremendously destructive. So, just actually read with a class of mine, Elizabeth Colbert's work on the 6th extinction, and we do seem to be in it. No longer before it, but we seem to have entered a mass extinction crisis that is rather pathetically driven by us, since it's quite possible that it will also end up extinguishing us. But it does not need to. It's still early enough to get hold of this and to use some of this anthropic talent actually to get the point, to have our eyes open to the apocalypse that we're bringing on, to actually receive the revelation and begin the next stage of the serious transformation of our ways as a species, and that means above all, of course, of our global economy and its dependence on fossil fuels, and that above all, really above all in the atmosphere. But that's just one major symptom, the perhaps major symptom of the Anthropocene illness. But I'd be interested in your experimenting further with the Homozoic The problem is that, yeah, Homo might even be even worse than Anthropos for its masculinity, but
Yeah.
there's not much of a solution with either of those terms for that. But what does one say? Humanozoic.
Yeah. Well, let me go on to because early in the book you talk about we have this issue, and I use the term global warming simply because climate change to me seems too broad. There's good climate change, bad climate change. The
Yeah.
thing that's the actual problem is the global warming on a global scale. So that's why I generally prefer that term. It's a little bit more specific, but you mentioned how that we know how to fix the problem, but uh, we need the will. I've always said we need to take the approach that we have a world war mindset against our own worst instincts. And in reading some of parts of your book and thinking about how modern media politics is dealing things and dragging their feet, it brought to me. I'm not. You probably are aware of that famous essay by Emerson, Nature, where he becomes a transparent eyeball, all about impulses. It seems that a lot of people, even scientists, even people in me, even leaders think like, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We're just here watching things decay rather than being an active participant. So, if I don't know if you can take up that.
Yeah, that's a powerful image of this sort of planet-shaped eyeball. And there is a danger that we just are trapped in our own gaze, and that it's a kind of fixation where our human gift of self-awareness just is caught in this fixation on ourselves with a profound narcissism. So it's in part an admiring gaze in which we fail to recognize the self-destructiveness that is now coming on at a whole new level. But it's also, it's also a gaze that is, as you say, sometimes a form of paralysis that we can see but do nothing about it. So yeah, it's a tremendous challenge now to connect the knowledge that we have as Homo sapiens, the knowledge that we have, to our capacity to be Homo agens, that is to have collective agency of a new kind. Right now, agency is largely controlled by a few global governments, and especially by the global economy. So when we talk about we are bringing on global warming, yeah, it's a very imbalanced we, isn't it? And yet we, those of us, you and I, who have actually very little to do with the actual causing of the global warming, nonetheless have to be taking responsibility for it and calling others to do so. And that means not just to know, but somehow to activate a knowing that's also a doing. Biblically, if I may, since it does seem that I'm a theologian, actually, I might say that this is very meaningfully encoded in the Gospel of John, whose Jesus announces that the truth will set you free, because the disciples are saying we don't know what to do if you're gone. He's predicting that he will die very soon. We'll be lost without you, and he's going to say to them, no, you won't be lost because you know me. I am the truth, the way, the life, the truth. But the point is, the truth is that which sets you free. And this knowing of him is a knowing in a relationship in this case to one who sought in every deed to embody a loving justice. And so that love is actually the energizing force of the knowing that we need, this truth that sets free, a truth that liberates, so a truth that doesn't just know the facts, even the facts that we do need to know, like the facts of how the climate is changing and just what's driving it, But it needs to be, doesn't it, a truth that liberates, and in that way that emancipates us into some form of collective agency, which you're doing with interviews, like the ones that you've been doing for almost 20 years, as I understand it. That's a way of taking knowledge beyond mere gazing at ourselves or at the objects of our world, but actually trying to enact dialogues that move into some forms of life and action, freedom, liberation from the kinds of bonds that are constricting our transformative potential.
Catherine, you don't necessarily go into detailed monetary policy or explicit financial politics of global warming or the climate crisis. But I wondered what your thoughts are, before we get back specifically to some of the points in the book. What are your thoughts on economy? And, for example, here in the COVID thing, a lot of politicians in the U.S. seem to give a damn more about the economy than the well-being and the life of people. And I often said to people, well, you know, corpses aren't known for their great economies. And so do you think that capitalism itself over the last couple hundred years since the Industrial Revolution has been the major driver of this climate problem? And do we need to get away from what I have always called a pelf-based economy, meaning money alone? That there has to be some better way to have an economy. If we're just trying to get away from fossil fuels, there's going to be some other thing we're going to screw up. I think there needs to be something deeper than just switching A to B to C fuel-wise. We have to think of new ways of how to relate to each other in terms of how we promote a society. So what is your sense about how economy and how the economy plays into this?
Yeah, well, you're again asking a kind of question that already contains the terms of a very rich answer to itself. But yes, I do think that the global economy, particularly in its primary form of neoliberal capitalism, is very much the driving force of the planetary destructiveness that we're seeing on multiple fronts, every kind of environmental toxicity and pollution. But above all, of course, it's the driver of the release of the carbon dioxide that's warming the planet. So, yeah, just economic answers to a problem that's driven by the economy are sure to mess us up in some new way. I think you're right. But, I don't think we're going to find economic answers to a problem that's caused by this economy without already some significant shifting in how we understand economics to need to work. And here's a way to think about it, Dan, to help people think about it. That, again, going to the Greek root of a word, I think I'm always tempted to do that. That's the biblical studies, I suppose. But economy comes from the Greek terms oikos and nomos, oikos being the word for home. So economy is supposedly then the law of the home. The household code, because the fundamental units of the economy in the ancient world were, of course, the households. And in some sense, that remains the case. What we need to help people recognize now is that that same root, oikos, for home, is the root of ecology. It's the same eco. So, and in the term ecology, the logos, the word or the principle of the home, we have a really important etymological insight into how our shared ecology is our shared dwelling, that the earth is our common home. And if the earth is our common home, then that is the common oikos, then the oikonomos has to be answerable to the oikologos. And so the economics has to be in sync with the ecology of that common home. And just to recognize that the economy is there to serve us all, and not only human beings, but to serve the common home with an utterly encompassing terrestrial understanding of the commons, the earth commons, and what it means to share planetary life together with each other.
If I could just pick up on that, because I've often said to people about the public commons, and that's and the common weal, and that those are ideas that are lost in current society, and just getting back to the Christian aspect of it, we can't just have a limitless growth of economy on this planet because it'll destroy things. All the rest of the world can't live like Americans do. So what do you think it will take to get that? We always hear about the Christian work ethic. I'm not religious myself, but I was raised a Lutheran, and the Lutherans were all about not being wasteful, about sharing, about if the poor are in a country, the rich should share with those in the country. The rich country should share with the poor countries. It seems to me that most of the countries in the West, which are derived from Christian values, so to speak, don't seem to have that kind of. There's only a convenient Christianity for them in that they don't want to do the hard work that supposedly Jesus would have said about dealing with these crises and taking care of the poor and the ill and the sick and whatever. So if you can expand on that a moment.
No, it'll probably be a few moments.
Okay.
Yeah. I love the question, and yes, thinking of the common home in terms of an economy that has to be in coordination with the ecology is all about a rich understanding of the common good, of therefore how the wealth must be common, the commonwealth. And of course, it's hard even to get the discourse of the common going because someone will slyly say, "Oh, that sounds like communism." That's just an easy evasion, because of course these notions of the common, yes, were taken into forms of communism, which also in many ways betrayed them, and certainly betrayed ecologies of the earth. But communism is not right now our problem. So the economies that are doing in the common good are the opposite of communist. But as you say, the nations of the Western world, the democratic nations, are all based in a Christian background, and so that's why a lot of people like me have decided to be Christian or stay Christian, even though we see all of the hypocrisies and the self-contradictions and the failings of institutionalized Christianity. We nonetheless have chosen certain institutions of Christianity to work with. Why? Because we think some people have to fight the hypocrisy of Christendom from within. Some of us have to remind Christian communities of what Jesus was actually about. I mean, was he joking when he said, if you have two coats, give one away to the poor? Was he just kidding around? Ironically, when he said, if you want to honor me, don't say Lord, Lord. Go honor the weak. Go honor the poor, the widow, the needy. Help them. So if you want to serve the Lord, serve the poor. So there are those of us who just think it's important to hold up those parts of the gospel that have been so effectively repressed by so much of of Christianity in its history, as Christianity became already in the 4th century an imperial religion, and also betrayed by the secularized forms of Christendom that are acting themselves out in our secular democracies and economies. So some of us have to keep holding up the actual like, teachings of the gospel. And because we do, there are actually mainline denominations, and a lot of Lutheran churches very much express this. A lot of United Methodist ones do. A lot of mainline Protestants do actually support a strong social justice ethos and economy. And so I'm proud of the work of the Christian left around the world. And yeah, it's always not enough, like the Democratic Party. But I'm proud of the work that continues and of the very strong, progressive pockets that continue to work for a strong sense of the oikos, of the shared planet, of the common good. I'm glad to be an educator in a school that's committed to social justice and economic transformation and responsibility, and therefore ecological sustainability.
So when you were talking about the communists, I thought of the RLC, and I remember as a boy looking at old map books around McNally, and now that's virtually all desertified. And other than the global warming, that's probably the greatest ecological disaster of the last 100 years, the loss of that sea. But I wanted to talk about something in your second chapter that's called Morning Bird, and you talk about how the bald eagle was being saved from extinction and how we should have better listened to Native Americans. And I have to take a little bit of an objection to that, because I think it invokes sort of the noble savage stereotype. Because if you look at, for example, when Native American ancestors came over the land bridge, which is from Siberia to Alaska, almost within 100 to 200 years of their getting to an area, all the ancient megafauna was wiped out. I mean, so even the Native Americans, not only just thousands of years ago, if you look at Mississippian culture, or if you look at some of the Mayan cultures, the evidence is compounding that they basically cause a lot of ecological disasters themselves, much more limited than we are doing, certainly. But I was just wondering, do you think that it was sort of overstating the case to say to listen to Native Americans? Because this is a human tendency. Humans, to use the thing, they screw things up. I mean, we're good at that. It doesn't matter whether we're European or Native Americans.
Oh, I think it matters. And no, I don't think I overstated at all in the book. I don't say we should take Native Americans as the ideal. I don't say we should, return to the ways of indigenous people. I don't say that indigenous peoples didn't also make significant mistakes, and that we wouldn't want to be outgrowing some of those. I do think the amount of destruction that they caused is trivial compared to what we're causing. And that it's our colonization of the Americas that's made possible the level of destruction that's going on. So, but my point isn't to say that any group of humans are perfect or constitute an ideal that we can return to. My point is that there were much more ecological and balanced lifestyles being practiced by Native peoples, but Native peoples were also not always native to one place. They were involved in mass migrations, and it's the dynamic of mass migrations on our planet, the various forms of movement that then also issue much later in modernity into the huge mobilizations through colonization. But these migrations do carry invasive species with them, do contribute to the extinction of local ones. It's just nothing comparable in the indigenous world to that in ours. But yes, I agree. We're a somewhat effed up species. That's why there's a myth at the beginning of the Bible about sin and about this sort of fundamental flaw that's expressed by our very talent, the sense of knowledge that we have, this level of consciousness that is then the plucking of a forbidden fruit. So that there's some, it's an ancient myth that's endlessly misused, but it carries an intuition, doesn't it, about how there's something basically screwed from very close to whatever the beginnings are of our species. That there's something in our talent, our capacity for a certain heightened consciousness and self-awareness that from very early seems to have allowed modes of perilous collective behavior, so that we're not now in our patterns completely alien to the humans who lived in caves, but I think it's important to recognize the qualitative differences of what the modern civilization of the last 500 years has enabled in terms of mass destruction, of ultimate extinction for our species. I'm not saying that's bound to happen, but the momentum is strong. But as I think you might agree, there are also other strands of development all along, of forms of more humane relations to the rest of humanity, more just and wise creaturely relations to the rest of the creation. And we have real gifts. It's just there's something about our particular giftedness as a species that's very available to a tremendous distortion that's ultimately self-destructive.
Later in the book, you mentioned former President Donald Trump and how some people saw him as a messiah or messianic figure. I think, and I got from the sense from your writing that you sort of reject the idea that a lot of people had, say, in the last year or two, that if we just get rid of Trump, everything will be okay. And I reject that too, because I mean, Trump to me isn't the problem. He's just the symptom of a larger, deeper cancer. And so do you agree with that? And if so, expound.
Oh, well, I absolutely agree with that. Of course he's a symptom. Otherwise, such a diseased set of political processes would not have manifest around him. They manifest because they were already there. I mean, yes, he's a particularly garish, vulgar symptom of the kind of power greed formula that is running our upper classes to a very large extent, therefore our economy to a very large extent, therefore our world to a tragic extent. He's a symptom, and he is worse in some ways than certain rather similar symptoms that were coming into play already in an interesting new way with Ronald Reagan in 1980. Important to me because we see there a new merger of the Christian right with political conservatism and with a real political right wing, and that's gone on and on. Sometimes less directly, sometimes more directly. It was quite direct again under George Bush, the first, and very much the second, and keeps a supercharge going between a very purely secular neoliberal capitalist paradigm and the energies of the American religious right. And that's a dangerous combination, and Trump's able to really get that fired up. extraordinarily. Yeah, how is it that conservative Christians could ever own him? He's what if he weren't a Republican, they would have been just constantly, denouncing as a fornicator and an adulterer. But because of the political fusion between the religious and political right, just all of his personal morality could be forgiven by these Christian moralists. Yeah, he's certainly not the problem, though he makes himself an unbearable problem when he comes into power or when he has great influence, as he still does behind the scenes. But, right. I mean, the notion that any individual is the problem is just itself a symptom, isn't it? It's a symptom of the kind of individualism that keeps us delusional, liberal and conservative.
I want to get back to talking about a couple of words that you use and define them, and then you can put them in context to your overall argument in the book. Chapter 6 is called Weaponizing the Word. You talk about the word and the sword, sort of S/word, and they're sort of being sort of melded together almost. And then you talk about utopia and give a definition of that, similar to the way you do apocalypse, how we're sort of misdefining it. So let's talk first about the sword, the word, and then utopia and what they mean to your book.
Yeah, thank you. The little slash after the S of sword is a way of speaking, especially to fellow Christians, about the danger that the Word of God gets mobilized as a weapon. And it's a danger that is very manifest in the book of Revelation. So I might think that there is prophetic vision in the book of Revelation, but I think it's also got a very deformed side that's distant from the Gospels, quite alien in its spirit to the teaching of radical love, let alone forgiveness. So the Word, as the Christian Word of God, needs to be attended to carefully, because constantly through history, starting with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, the cross has been mobilized as a sword. The Word of God has been this weapon. So the play with sword word is just looking at how you have a messianic figure in the book of Revelation that is the supreme warrior. He's never called Jesus, and he isn't Jesus. So the lamb figure is the one who seems to be the symbol for Jesus, but there is a messianic super warrior on a white horse, of course, who's bearing that sword, that messianic sword. And so when the Word of God becomes the sword borne by a messianic horseman, leader of any sort, and we're in trouble. And it's the kind of trouble we were just talking about the fusion of the Christian right with the political right. That's an extreme form of the weaponization of the word. So for me, as a Christian, it is just a constant labor to try to de-weaponize the so-called Word of God. If it's a Word of God, then it's speaking a word of peace, a word of justice, a word of fairness, a word of warning against those who take advantage of their power and their wealth to manipulate and exploit the poor and the vulnerable. It's a word that demands transformation. It's a word that brings down a global economy like the kind we have in order to lift up our potential to be to be the gifted species that we could be, where our gifts are actually used as a gift to the earth and a gift to all of us. That is, where there's actually graciousness, where there's actually a shared sense of a common world, where we actually get into motion, and instead of wielding swords, we start wielding wielding our pens, our computers, our various talents, our tools to, as the Jewish tradition says, to perform tikkun olam, the healing of the world.
So, how about the utopia? Because you used the proper definition that I think it was Thomas More used, that it's no place. That his implicit use of the term was that this isn't real.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of double meaning and a word play that he already was picking up on. That utopos can be spelled either way. It can be from the Greek. It can be the U of ou, meaning none, no place, or utopos, meaning good place. So one might say, for now, the good place is no place at all. It hasn't yet quite come into being, and that's what utopia meant for Thomas More too. That it's no place now, but it could be a place. The good place doesn't now exist, but there's the possibility. And so, yeah, I see the Book of Revelation as very much a source for that Western utopian tradition, where the good place, the New Jerusalem, does not now exist, but is a real possibility, is a dream, is a vision that's deep in our species genes, in our civilizational unconscious. It's possible that imagery that's much deeper than the Book of Revelation, the notion of the New Jerusalem, the new heaven and earth, the new creation, that's a set of images going back to the Hebrew prophets, Jeremiah.
If I can just ask, isn't the notion of the New Jerusalem, isn't that where the conservative Christians got their idea of the shining city on the hill? That whole Reagan era thing.
That's what they use it for.
Yeah.
Right. And it was also used by most of the socialist movements of the 19th century to indicate their hope for a just global civilization in which everything is shared in common, and in which there is no more imperial control of power and of economics. So yeah, it's an image that, like most of the images of the Bible that are powerful, like the Word of God, it's an image that has been used for great destruction, but that's also there at the origins of most of our great hopes for social justice and transformation. Those hopes are rooted in that Hebrew prophetic tradition. Those demands for an overcoming of the evil and of the injustice, of the oppression. So yeah, it's a profoundly ambivalent set of images, but I don't think we have time to wait for some set of pure images and traditions to come forth that can't be abused. I think we have to work with what we've got and try to fight back the abuse with what is so perhaps still utopic potential. It's still not a concrete place, but we have inklings. Some places are a lot better than other places, as well,
So let me just talk about when I was a boy growing up in the early 70s. Even then, with the advent of the first Earth Days, there was the idea that reforestation and certainly population control were big things. This was not even taking into consideration global warming now. And it seems to me it's a very odd thing that these two things, reforestation and population control, are probably the two things that immediately could have the biggest impact on changing the climate. even more so than switching from fossil fuels immediately. Because if you have less humans and if you have more trees, the you're not going to have the influx of the carbons and the methanes and all of these
Yeah.
warming gases. And yet, this is the simplest thing to do, and yet even that there's foot dragging. What is your take on those things, and why
Well,
population control isn't even spoken of?
right. Yeah, it seems to be politically too sensitive. But man, it is. I mean, it is the case that reforestation and the bringing down of the population numbers for species are of supreme importance for getting the climate uh, uh, back to something at least sustainable. Yeah. However, they aren't now. If those policies had been, if good policies of so-called population control, of 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 reasonable and democratic and socially educational modes of bringing down population numbers and reforestation had been pursued from your childhood on, we would be in a very different boat. But they aren't fast enough solutions now. I mean, they aren't in that way simple solutions. It will take it takes it takes a generation to grow a tree that's doing much, and we're talking about generations for bringing down the population numbers. So this work needs to go on, but it needs to go on hand in hand, of course. And and I know that you mean this, that you're not saying these are strategies that should replace the bringing down of fossil fuel output, but it needs to go. Yes, reforestation and sane population policies need to go hand in hand with the the changing of the basis or economy off of the changing of it away from carbon release. But one good thing is that I was rather surprised to come to understand over the last few months that actually population numbers are coming down. That there is a surprising decline of populations globally through most continents. So that's very interesting. That is actually going on, and that is largely the result of the
Well,
education of women.
in the developed West, populations are exploding in the poorer countries that are most vulnerable to sea rise and things like that. Like
Yeah,
Nigeria is a good example.
it is a good example, and the poorer countries are the countries that the wealthier countries can support in transforming the policies that are creating impossible population growth. Yeah, it's an international problem, but the total population is coming down in ways that are surprising, and that involve China as well. So big populations are being affected positively. That doesn't take care of the problem, and it doesn't mean that we should do more in the direction in this wealthy nation, with, for instance, the anti-choice policy is obviously in a direction aimed against reproductive responsibility in general. So we are in danger of going very much in the wrong direction. But it is possible that much progress could be made. It can't be made fast enough. So we need, and trees won't grow fast enough, and it's horrific, isn't it, that instead of growing trees, actually, we have these horrendous forest fires going on and through the West, and in states that might be the ones already inclined to plant more trees, to reforest. And they will, but it's tragic that in fact the forest fires are on top of the willed, economically driven deforestation. So yes, planting trees and planting a lot fewer human seeds of ourselves, and working on on bringing down the CO2 economy and finding alternatives that are sustainable are what we need to be doing, but there needs to be the political will to do it all much faster than is now the tendency, hoping that there's just enough catastrophe in the world going on that more people wake up, but that it's not so much catastrophe that it's too late.
So the end of the book, you give sort of four possibilities of a post-apocalyptic, not meaning apocalyptic as is currently defined, but as you define it. One is that it's outright extinction for the species. The second one is what you would be called the brute life, sort of, I guess, a return to caveman ways. The third is a New Jerusalem for the super rich, which to me strikes me as sort of the Morlocks and the Eloys. And then a cybertopia, sort of a Matrix-like society. Now, so do you personally think that that's likely, or do you think that we're going to avoid, like, are we going to rally and have like the Civilian Conservation Corps and have international help, or what?
Well, I don't know what's going to happen, and no one knows. But I hope that none of these four alternatives come through. And brute remainders, by the way, is a neo-barbarism, but it would be much worse than life for the cave people, which might have been actually quite satisfying. But this would be a fallen life with a lot of remainders of what had been, and just sheer toxicity to live with, and. Yeah, so those are the four very unhappy possible outcomes. Unhappy in different degrees. Cybertopia would be nice again for some kind of upper class. But I do suggest also, after a pause at the end of the book, that there are three more positive possibilities. I call them village Earth, where there is tremendous catastrophic breakdown ecologically and civilizationally, and urban civilization really does crumble, but that a kind of new rural population develops rather quickly and wisely from the ruins, in which there is a local life that's healing, that's restorative of the planet. And local agriculture's economies developing with the wisdom of what had brought on the catastrophe and the fall of civilization in the sense of civis, city. So yeah, that's village Earth possibility. The sixth possibility I mentioned, second better one, is cosmocopolis. Which has something to do with your sense, I think, of cosmos and ethics, Cosmoetica, in which there is a sense of new creation, catalyzed by catastrophe, in spite of billions dying very badly. But some critical mass survives this one, unlike village Earth for the cosmocalypse, I should say. There's actually a polis, that is, there's a city, an urban world that does manage to reassemble itself, and so there's an eco-civilization that develops from the ruins. That's a possibility. And again, it would now draw on great knowledge from our civilization, but including the knowledge of our self-destruction and what brought that on. That's a real possibility. And the seventh, the nicest possibility, and the one I really hope for, I call the Age of Enlivenment, which shares a lot with the cosmocalypse and with village Earth, but doesn't involve such horrendous levels of mass destruction. It goes through apocalypse and a lot of death that could have been avoided, a lot of ecological and human death that could have avoided, but But there's actually, in that scenario, a survival of a legacy that has living populations perpetrating it, so that there's a lot of chaos, a lot of loss, but less the sense of the end of civilization as we know it. But again, even if we lose civilizations, we know it. There can be a new civilization that grows up, might. But the best option would be for civilization as we know it not to fully undergo its collapse, but to undergo a more positive apocalypse. That is, to actually continue with this eye-opening that's going on for some populations that could go on for a critical mass of us. So that's the hope that I have. The best hope is that we might actually enliven our life together by bringing on this transformation, and it won't elude a lot of doom for a lot of vulnerable people and endless species. But it could be a great healing from our cluster of injustices, a seeing through of how our white supremacism, our classism, our ecological madness, our crazy weapons, how our civilization of mass destruction and of lethal levels of oppression and naivete is responsible for what will have gone wrong, but has been being recognized as responsible for so long by so many who are continuing to grow in our awareness and to enliven our lives. So it's not a return to an old Enlightenment model of, white guys who know best to bring on a more sustainable and just world, but an enlivenment that involves a new creation, a new creativity by a vast diversity of us who can join our forces, join our very different causes, our causes of Black lives mattering, of ecological lives mattering, of all poor lives mattering, of non-European lives mattering, of the lives of non-humans mattering, to bring these matterings in their irreducible differences and intensities into a more effectual solidarity.
So, Catherine, you said that early in the interview that you are not a biblical literalist. So, what role do you see, though, as a Christian, Jesus Christ playing? I assume that you believe that he was a historical figure. Do you see Jesus Christ as a redeemer, or do you see him as a prophet leading the way? And how is he going to be seen differently? Hopefully, if we have those more positive endings at the end of that tunnel, does theology, does Christianity, does even Islam or Judaism change after we hopefully survive this?
Oh, of course they change. They change deeply. All of the religions would be changing, but in enlivening ways, and in ways that would be in touch with their origins in interesting ways. So I could kind of fantasize, Jesus marching arm in arm, with the Buddha, and with a few African tribal wise people, with an incarnation of Krishna. I can see. I can see all of our wise men and women holding hands with a deepening pluralism. So, these religions all have much to contribute to the overcoming of our present civilization of self-destruction, because all of the major religious ways of the world, including indigenous ways, have rigorous criticisms of selfishness, of egocentrism, of economic forms that privilege just a few. There are these resources across the world, traditions, differently distributed, differently articulated, but resources for very concrete sharing of the goodness of the world, very materially, and with a sense of great blessing. So yes, I certainly see Jesus as a historical figure, one who exercised great influence. Some of that influence, I no doubt, would have him rolling over in his grave if he were in a grave somewhere. But I see Jesus as also a redeemer in a rigorous sense of the term. That is, that his efficacy in the world is intended to have a redemptive effect on our shared life. But that means it's intended to enliven communities, to be themselves redemptive, and to join forces with the redemptive energies of Judaism, of Hinduism, of Buddhism, of atheism. These are all traditions that, in their ethical core, not in their abusive edges, but in their ethical core, are redemptive. So I don't mean Jesus as a redeemer in some supernatural, exclusivist sense, but redemption in the very spirited, material sense of working together for a really rich, beautiful, radically shared life together with each other across the religions, across the irreligions, indeed across the species of this planet. That's redemptive. That's what the gospel picks up upon from the Jewish prophetic traditions. So you find other resources for in every tradition. A lot of Christians I know are very dependent, as I was, on Buddhism. I needed my Zen Buddhism as a teenager to even get interested in Christianity. So we need our mixes of religion, of ethical atheism, of multiple pathways of spirituality, or just what we call of being spirited in order to enliven the transformation. And I think the spirits of all of the old religious leaders will be very much with us in this.
Is that what you mean?
If those spirits are still alive somehow in some mysterious cosmic afterlife, I'm sure they're all appalled at the abuses, at the misuses of their teachings and their traditions.
Just hearing you speak the last minute or so, is that what you mean with a term like intercarnations, which is one of your other books? And if you can, just briefly summarize that term and what you do in that book.
Yeah. Intercarnations was a playful way of opening up the doctrine of incarnation. Because again, if you read it in its historical context and in its very Jewish modality, the incarnation, as the Gospel of John proposes the teaching of it, is of the divine in human flesh. And in a distinctive and self-conscious way in Jesus. But what's beautiful about it is that it is a teaching of how the divine filled the flesh of the world, how the divine enters the world in a body, in embodied form. And the trick is for us to be conscious of, know this, to practice incarnation. The point of the distinctive experience of incarnation that's identified with Jesus isn't then to just worship him, do the Lord thing that he hated. No, it's to invite that incarnation to happen in everyone, everywhere, to take the divine, take the the wisdom of the cosmos into our flesh, into our material practices, into our shared bodies. And that's not just then going to be called the body of Christ. It's going to be also the body of Gaia, which many Christian theologians now also talk about, the body of the earth. So incarnation is a way of signaling we're not talking about one single unique incarnation in Jesus as the Christ. That has its important symbolic role to play, but only redemptively if it's opening up this incarnation in which we're inviting God, if we call it that, or the good, if we call it that, or the wisdom of the cosmos, if we call it that, to become incarnate, not just in every one of us, but in our interrelations, in our entanglements with each other and with all of the non-humans that make up our world and even our bodies. So it's calling for incarnation, not just to be of all of us individuals, but of our interactivities together, that something sacred is coming into flesh. And if it doesn't become flesh, it just remains abstract or external and subject to a lot of dogmatic manipulation.
The other book that I wanted to just briefly ask you on was your book called Cloud of the Impossible, and it got brought to mind the idea of an electron cloud and the idea of physical indeterminacy. Was that any part of that book, or what is that about?
Yeah, it is a part of that book, The Cloud of the Impossible. Right. It's actually a phrase of Nicholas of Cusa, a phrase from the 15th century, but it refers to a kind of cloud that confronts us when we become aware of the contradictions that beset us. And he was a theologian. In fact, he was a cardinal, and he was thinking about contradictions in the understanding of God, in his understanding of God. Yeah, he was out there, and so he said these contradictions push us into a cloud of impossibility. But it's and it's painful because then we confront the contradictions in our own thinking, in our faith, in our world. But if we will confront it, that's where the holy opens up. That's where the impossible becomes possible. So I'm using that metaphor not just in a theological, but also in a very secular sense. And I draw it into some significant relationship actually with some quantum physics understandings of clouds of possibility, and yeah, I don't want to get all off into it, but I do have a whole chapter on spooky entanglements, I call it, the physics of non-separability, and get into the way in which quantum entanglements and spooky action at a distance are expressing something in the material world that's very like that cloud of the impossible.
Well, let me just bring that to the material world, because I've had many jobs over my lifetime, too many to list. I don't know which is more interesting, my work life or my prior to marriage sex life, but it's interesting because having worked many years in retail, there's the old axiom about giving people choice, in that if you have maybe 10 types of yogurt, people feel empowered to make the right choice. But if you have 100 types of yogurt, they're fearful of making the wrong choice. And I wonder if one of the things in dealing with climate issues is that people see there are so many things that we could do. I've said, we have to throw everything at the wall and, throw 100 options, and if 12 stick and work, go with them. But I think a lot of people think there's just so much that's wrong that we can't do anything, rather than having a leadership would say, no, this is what we have to do. We have to do A, B, C, D, and in that order. And that gives people confidence, rather than having them just sort of nebulously, oh, the world is ending kind of thing. And so it's ironic to me when you were talking about that just came to my mind, this old axiom in retailing about choice. Does that have any resonance with you?
Oh, it does. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, there is a kind of cloud of possibilities that becomes sort of nebulosity itself.
Yeah.
It's a real figure of cloudiness, and that when we're entertaining too many possibilities or just confronted by them, that is the experience of the impossible that kicks in. So if there are to be real possibilities that might get actualized into realities, then yes, there has to be a prioritizing, and that for that to be a wise prioritizing, there has to be a discerning of, 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 of what is of priority amidst the multiple possibilities. And that's where Nicholas Apuza's old image of the cloud is interesting. I mean, it's about accepting that there is pain in entering that cloud, but face it, enter into it, like meditate on the content of that cloudiness, the multiplicity, the feeling of impossibility. Tune into that, and then real possibilities begin to reveal themselves. And it's not that there's some simple divine revelation that kicks in. He wasn't naive like that, and I don't think that notion will help us now. But there's a discernment that we can help each other with, and we can't just entrust it to any leader, obviously, but we want leaders who can articulate what we, in some collective, maybe even democratic form together, are discerning are the priorities. Is it reforestation? Is it population control? Is it changing of our carbon usage? Is it all three? How do we order this? Because when we face all this multitude of possibilities that kick us into the feeling of the impossible, we quickly turn into nihilists. We really don't think anything. And nihilism isn't any better than denialism, that denialism of science that's on the right about COVID and about the climate. But denialism and nihilism, have the same impact.
It seems to me one of the hallmarks of leadership is discretion, in the sense that to make things discreet, to bring things from that cloud and make them discreet and visible.
Yeah, but it's important to remain conscious that there is that cloud, that there is always a density of possibilities verging on the impossible. Just to retain a kind of consciousness, even if it's usually semi-conscious, but something that we occasionally meditate on, like the multiplicity of possibilities that push toward the impossible. Just occasionally to meditate on that immensity in its impossibility, also in its beauty, because there are always more possibilities. So I think we need that consciousness of the cloud, and we need the clarity that can reveal itself exactly as you say, as a few key priorities that are based on an account, analytic account, scientific account, and narrative, communal, ethical account that together can make for reasonable politics and economics. That together can be shaped only by discerning the needed possibilities. But that takes some wisdom, doesn't it?
Yeah. Finally, I just wanted to ask you, so now what is on the horizon for you in your next work ideationally? And is there some sense in yourself that are you working on a magnum opus, the thing that's going to be your book stop, that your door stopper, that's going to sum up your career?
Oh, I think if I thought in those terms, I'd be really trapped in the cloud of the impossible. So I tend to think modestly and then in bursts about work that I want to do, and I'm still following up on the Facing Apocalypse project and hoping to get it out and around and get more discussions going. I am thinking that I'd like to do a work that would tie together what I've done in the Apocalypse text with what I did in another book, The Face of the Deep, a theology of becoming. That's a book that also uses very, very intensively a biblical metaphor from the first two verses of the Bible, because I make a strong argument for 300 pages that that all the interpretation of Scripture and then its secularizations are, God created the world from nothing. That doesn't happen in the Bible. There is no nothing. There's no moment of creation from nothing. There's creation from chaos, from the Tehom, the ocean, the oceanic deep, that's formless, chaotic possibilities. So I've worked on that in terms of Genesis, this bottomless ocean of possibilities that's never just nothing. No thing, maybe, but not a nothing that an omnipotent God acts on, like from the outside.
Well, even in physics, they talk about fields of potentiality, that there is nothing, that human beings can't even really conceive of nothing, because black is not nothing, silence is not nothing, it's black and silence.
Yeah, and the Big Bang, is probably preceded by lots of other forms of bursts and creations and explosions in a multiverse. And yeah, that whether it's a crazy multiverse of of an infinite number of universes at any moment, or what I think is more meaningful, a kind of a serial multiverse, where the Big Bang is a compression of energies from the collapsing of some prior universe. Yeah, but we don't know. But what we know is that the notion of mere nothingness is not scientific, and I've been probably the major voice arguing that creation from nothing has no biblical basis. It's just amazing how those verses get misread. So I'd like to put that sense of the beginning from nothing together with my sense of an end, which is also not the reduction to nothing of a world.
Just one final point, because it came up as you spoke there. There's always the East-West sort of Buddhist versus Judaic faith ideas of being and becoming, and a lot of, I think there's a chic kind of idea in the West that being, it's like the Hare Krishnas or the 1960s ethos, but to me, I don't think there's that big of a difference between. I mean, you can be and be satisfied to be at that moment, but if you're just being, you're in eternal stasis. You have to be becoming something too, and So, what is this? Finally, what is your take on the being becoming thing?
Well, that's a whole other conversation. I mean, my theology. The subtitle of the book I mentioned is A Theology of Becoming, and the philosophical background of my theology is that of a philosophy of becoming, that of the great mathematician and cosmologist Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote Process and Reality in the 1920s. And a whole school of theology emerged out of that in Claremont, California, largely through my teacher, John Cobb. It's called Process Theology. But it's based on this philosophy of Whitehead's that is one immense cosmology of becoming, that any notion of changeless being is an abstraction. Changeless beings exist as abstractions. The color blue is eternally the same as itself. The number one is eternally the same and changeless as itself. They just are. But, one cup of coffee is a lot emptier than it was at the beginning. The molecules, the electrons in the cup are constantly shifting, becoming. That there isn't anything which actually exists that isn't an act of becoming, is the philosophy that I believe in. That to be is to be a becoming, and it's to be becoming now and now and now. And you and I are not exactly the same beings that we were even a minute ago, let alone when we started this conversation.
The river of self.
Yeah, chugging right along. And that, we are entangled in each other in ways that some might consider good, some might not, but that are going to be influences for us, conscious, largely unconscious, forever. But that's true of all of us, dangling with all of us. So, my sense of the universe is that of a cosmos of perpetual becoming, but it's a becoming in relation. It's a relational becoming, that we don't just become, like along some train track through time, but we're becoming in our entangled intertwinings with all of the other creatures of our particular world, that become part of this, that are into the particular shade of the late afternoon sky here in the Catskills right now, and the impinging greens are becoming part of me. And I, in some sense, part of this environment, and that's all the dense entanglement of our becomings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a messy, very mobile universe.
Well, I want to thank you for a really good conversation. I'll link to your university page below, or not actually, is it? Oh, your katherinekeller.com. Yeah, so people can look up your work there. So again, thank you very much.